Right in the middle of the strategy meeting, the chief executive looked at the man across the table and said the words loud enough for everyone to hear. She told him he should be grateful she had even hired a single father like him. Nobody laughed. Nobody defended him either. Caleb Rowan closed his folder, swallowed the humiliation, and kept walking the room through the plan meant to save the largest contract the company had ever signed. When Victoria Harrington cut him off a second time, his phone lit up on the table. The name on the screen belonged to the chief executive of Harrington Group's biggest competitor, and the first sentence that man spoke made the entire room go silent. If you want to watch Caleb turn every ounce of that contempt into a reckoning Victoria never saw coming, hit subscribe right now so you do not miss how far this goes. A few hours earlier, none of it had started yet. Caleb arrived at Harrington Group before sunrise, the way he always did, carrying a folder thick with printouts and a coffee that had already gone lukewarm in the parking garage. The building was still mostly dark, only a handful of desk lamps burning on the operations floor, and he liked that hour precisely because nobody else was awake enough yet to interrupt his thinking. He set his bag down, opened his laptop, and let the quiet settle around him the way it always did before the rest of the company came pouring through the doors with their noise and their opinions. The Davenport account was sitting on the edge of collapse, a contract worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and Caleb was the only person in the building who had actually found the crack running through it. He had spotted a gap in the delivery schedule weeks earlier, buried inside a spreadsheet nobody else had bothered to open twice, tucked into a tab most people skipped past because it looked like routine housekeeping rather than the fault line it actually was. Nolan Pierce had reviewed the same numbers and missed it entirely, and Victoria had signed off on the plan without asking a single follow-up question. For 3 straight weeks, Caleb had quietly rebuilt the framework on his own time, running scenarios late at night after his son was finally asleep, because he did not trust anyone else in the building to catch what he had caught. He worked at the kitchen table with a single lamp on, laptop open beside a stack of grading papers, and a half-folded load of laundry, the ordinary debris of raising a child alone piled up around the extraordinary work he was doing in the margins of his evenings. He built out 3 separate contingency paths, stress-tested each one against worst-case supplier delays, and cross-checked every number twice before he trusted it enough to put it into a formal document. Nobody at Harrington Group had asked him to do any of it. He did it anyway, the way he did most things that actually mattered, quietly and without announcement, because he had learned a long time ago that competence rarely needed an audience to be real. There was a version of himself, years earlier, who might have walked straight into Victoria's office the moment he found the gap and demanded recognition for catching it before anyone else could. That version of him had existed once, before a difficult stretch of life had taught him that recognition was never guaranteed no matter how much it was deserved, and that the safest currency in any organization was simply being right when it counted most. So he kept building, kept checking his work against every angle he could imagine, and told himself that the plan speaking for itself would eventually be enough. Victoria knew exactly how capable he was. That was never the question. She kept him positioned 2 levels below where his work actually belonged, and she had her reasons she never said out loud in front of him but said freely to the people around her. She believed a man raising a child alone would always choose the safety of a paycheck over the risk of asking for what he deserved. Caleb had taken the job at Harrington Group after a rough stretch in his personal life, and Victoria had read that history the way a buyer reads a distressed asset, as leverage rather than a person. To her assistant, out of Caleb's earshot but not far enough, she once said that men like Rowan carry a mortgage and a kid, and men like that do not walk away from anything. She said it the way someone states a fact of nature, and she believed it completely. That belief was the mistake that would eventually cost her everything she had built her reputation on. She did not see quiet as patience being spent carefully. She saw it as proof that she could keep taking without ever paying a price. Victoria had grown up inside a family whose name sat on buildings and letterheads long before she ever earned a title of her own, and somewhere along the way she had absorbed the idea that people who did not come from that kind of comfort were simply built to endure more than everyone else. She did not think of it as cruelty. She thought of it as an accurate read of the world, the same way she might read a balance sheet, cold and confident, and entirely certain she was right. So on the morning the Davenport crisis finally reached the boardroom, Victoria did what she always did when the stakes climbed high enough to matter. She turned to Nolan Pierce, the vice president she had spent 2 years grooming in public, and asked him to present the recovery plan Caleb had built from nothing. Nolan had the polish Victoria valued most, an expensive education, a fluent command of boardroom language, and an ease in front of senior executives that photographed well even when the substance underneath it was thin. What he did not have was the instinct for finding the small, ugly detail buried 3 layers down inside a spreadsheet, the kind of detail that decided whether a company survived a bad quarter or spent the next 2 years explaining it to shareholders. Victoria had never seemed to notice the difference. Or perhaps she had simply decided it did not matter, as long as the person standing at the podium looked like the kind of leader she wanted the board to imagine when they pictured the company's future. Nolan stood at the head of the conference table and walked the executives through nearly the entire strategy Caleb had assembled alone. He used Caleb's language almost word for word, the same phrasing, the same structure, the same sequence of contingencies, stacked in the same order Caleb had drafted them in. Victoria praised him in front of the board before he had even finished his final slide, calling the plan sharp and decisive and exactly the kind of thinking Harrington Group needed more of. Caleb sat 2 seats down the table and watched his own work get handed to someone else in real time. When the final slide appeared on the screen, his name had already been removed from the credit line at the bottom, replaced with a generic label about the strategy team. Evelyn Sterling, the one board member who still asked questions instead of nodding along, wanted to know who had actually designed the contingency system behind the plan. Victoria answered in the vague, practiced way executives answer when they do not want the real name spoken aloud, calling it a joint effort from the strategy group. Caleb stayed calm and simply added 2 data points the room still needed, numbers that clarified exactly how tight the delivery window really was. Victoria cut him off before he could finish the second sentence, telling him flatly that he was there to support the people making the decisions, not to make them himself. The room absorbed that sentence the way a room absorbs something it has learned not to react to. After the meeting ended, Caleb caught Victoria alone in the hallway and asked, without any anger in his voice, why his name had disappeared from the final slide. She did not deny that it had happened. Instead, she told him he should focus on keeping a job with the kind of flexible schedule most companies would never offer someone in his situation. Then she went further, reminding him that most companies would not tolerate the demands of his schedule at all, and that he should remember exactly who had given a single father a chance when nobody else would. Caleb did not raise his voice. He only asked her quietly if that was really how she saw his value inside the company. Victoria answered without hesitation, telling him she saw exactly what he was worth. Caleb walked back to his desk with that sentence sitting in his chest like a stone, and he did not respond to it, not yet. He sat down, stared at the blank document on his screen for a long moment, and thought about the small apartment he had moved into after his marriage ended, the one with a mattress on the floor for the first 2 months because furniture had not made it up the priority list yet. He thought about the version of himself who had taken this job specifically because it promised stability during the one stretch of his life when stability had felt like the only thing worth chasing. He had traded ambition for predictability on purpose, and for a long time that trade had felt like wisdom rather than surrender. Sitting there with Victoria's words still ringing in his ears, he was no longer sure the trade had been worth what it cost him. He opened his laptop, cleared his afternoon meetings, and got back to preparing the numbers Davenport would need within the next 2 days. Around 4 in the afternoon, a new message appeared in his inbox, sent from the executive office of Whitmore Industries, the largest direct competitor Harrington Group had in the entire sector. The subject line was short and formal, requesting a private conversation at his earliest convenience. Caleb stared at it for a long moment before closing the laptop and heading home to make dinner for his son. He did not respond to the message that night. He wanted to think clearly, without the sting of the boardroom still steering his judgment, before he answered anything that could reshape the rest of his career. That evening he made dinner the way he always did, cutting vegetables while his son sat at the counter, narrating a story about a classroom project. And for an hour, Harrington Group and Victoria Harrington and the entire humiliating morning simply did not exist. It was one of the few skills he had built without meaning to over the past several years, the ability to set down a professional wound at the door and pick it back up only when the house was quiet again. After his son was asleep, he sat at the kitchen table with the message from Whitmore Industries still unopened in a browser tab, and he let himself feel, honestly, how tired he had become of being underestimated by people who had never once had to prove themselves the way he had. Long before Harrington Group, Caleb had quietly been the person behind a small logistics company's turnaround, a company that had been days away from losing its largest supplier relationship until he rebuilt its entire distribution model from scratch. The company survived, then grew, then was eventually acquired by a larger firm, and Caleb found himself job hunting again through no failure of his own. Grant Whitmore, the chief executive of Whitmore Industries, had heard about that turnaround years earlier through an industry contact and had simply never forgotten the name attached to it. Grant kept a private habit, one his own executives had learned to expect, of tracking talent that surfaced quietly inside difficult situations rather than the talent that simply photographed well in press releases. He had a short list he updated occasionally, names attached to problems other companies had assumed were unsolvable, and Caleb's name had been sitting near the top of that list for longer than either of them yet realized. Back inside Harrington Group, Victoria kept pulling Caleb into Nolan's projects, asking him to fix the weak points in plans that would still carry Nolan's name once they were finished. Caleb did the work because the company still needed it done correctly, but he started keeping careful records of everything, saved drafts, time-stamped emails, and a clear trail showing exactly which ideas originated where. It was not preparation for revenge. It was the ordinary discipline of a professional who understood that credit and responsibility had a way of disappearing in rooms like Victoria's when nobody kept a written record. During one late afternoon review, Caleb warned Victoria directly that if Harrington Group promised Davenport the delivery guarantee she wanted to offer, the company would likely breach its own supply capacity limits within the first quarter. Victoria waved the warning away without a second thought, telling him she paid him to solve problems, not to invent new reasons to be afraid of them. Caleb repeated the warning once more, calmly, and put it in writing so there would be no confusion later about who had raised the concern first. Victoria ignored the email entirely and, 2 days later, committed Harrington Group to the exact number Caleb had told her not to promise. She signed the agreement in front of the Davenport team with visible pride, treating the commitment as proof of her own decisiveness rather than a risk she had been explicitly warned about. Caleb read the confirmation email at his desk and felt the floor tilt slightly under everything he had built at the company so far. The following week, the crisis Caleb had predicted arrived almost exactly as he described it. Davenport's operations team discovered a gap between the promised delivery windows and Harrington Group's real production capacity, and they gave the company only 2 full days to present a credible fix before they would begin reviewing termination clauses. Victoria called an emergency session with the board, the chief financial officer, Nolan, Caleb, and several senior executives crowded into the largest conference room on the top floor. Caleb walked them through the situation with total professionalism, laying out exactly how narrow the window had become and what would be required to close the gap without losing the account entirely. Victoria did not want the board to learn that she had personally dismissed the original warning weeks earlier, so she began quietly shifting blame in Caleb's direction instead. She asked him, in front of everyone, whether contingency planning had not technically been his responsibility all along. Caleb reminded her, evenly, that he had sent the warning in writing and that the record still existed if anyone wanted to review it. Victoria's expression tightened, and instead of addressing the record, she pivoted straight into a personal attack meant to end the conversation before it went any further. When Caleb refused to simply accept the blame she was trying to hand him, she said the sentence that would define the rest of the day. She told him, in front of the entire leadership table, that he should be grateful she had hired a single father in the first place. The room went completely still. Nobody moved, and nobody spoke. The kind of silence that settles over a place when everyone understands something wrong has just happened, but nobody is willing to be the first to say so. The chief financial officer looked down at his notes as though the numbers on the page had suddenly become far more interesting than the moment unfolding around him. Even Nolan, who owed his own promotion to Victoria's favor, shifted uncomfortably in his seat, unwilling to meet Caleb's eyes across the table. Caleb felt his face stay perfectly still, the same disciplined calm he had spent years training into himself for exactly this kind of moment, even as something inside his chest tightened into a knot that would take hours to loosen. Victoria kept going anyway, telling him she had given him a level of flexibility people at his level did not normally receive from anyone. Caleb opened his mouth to answer her when his phone buzzed once against the table, the screen lighting up with a name that immediately caught Victoria's attention. It read Grant Whitmore, Whitmore Industries, and for a moment nobody in the room breathed. Victoria saw the name too, and something like a smirk crossed her face as she told him that if the call mattered more than his job, he was welcome to take it. Caleb looked at her for a long moment, longer than felt comfortable for anyone still seated at that table. Then he stood, pushed his chair in quietly, and walked out of the conference room without saying another word. Nolan stared down at his notes, unwilling to meet anyone's eyes. Evelyn Sterling watched Caleb leave and made a small note on the pad in front of her, the kind of note that would matter far more than anyone in that room realized yet. Out in the hallway, Caleb answered the call with his voice steady, despite everything that had just happened behind him. Grant Whitmore's tone carried none of the performative warmth Caleb had grown used to hearing from executives trying to win him over, and it did not waste time on small talk, telling him plainly that his board had approved the proposal and wanted Caleb to hear it directly from him first. He explained that Whitmore Industries wanted Caleb to take the role of Senior Vice President of Operations, a position with real decision-making authority rather than the kind of support role he currently held. The compensation, Grant said, would be nearly 3 times what he was currently earning, along with a level of autonomy Caleb had never been offered anywhere in his career. Most importantly, Grant made clear that Caleb would be the one making final calls, not simply the person quietly fixing decisions other people had already gotten credit for. Grant had no idea what had just happened inside that conference room, which made the timing feel less like rescue and more like recognition that had simply arrived at the right moment. Caleb asked him directly why Whitmore Industries wanted him specifically, and Grant answered without hesitation. He said that over the past several years, Caleb's name kept surfacing quietly behind 3 separate situations that other companies in the industry had assumed were unsolvable. People kept taking credit for his work, Grant told him, but that did not mean the rest of the industry had failed to notice who was actually responsible for it. Caleb did not accept anything on the spot, telling Grant he needed time to think it through properly before giving him an answer. He walked back into the conference room a few minutes later, and Victoria immediately tried to steer the moment back toward normal, asking if everything was fine, whether it had been some kind of family emergency. Caleb told her plainly that it had nothing to do with his family, that the call had come from Whitmore Industries. The entire tone of the room shifted the instant the name left his mouth. Nolan looked up sharply from his notes. The chief financial officer went quiet, and Victoria's expression hardened into something far less composed than the confidence she had been wearing all morning. She asked him what exactly Whitmore wanted with him, her voice tighter than she probably intended. Caleb answered simply that Whitmore apparently understood what he was worth. It was the first time all day that one of Victoria's own words had circled back and landed directly on her, and something in her expression flickered, quick and involuntary, before she managed to smooth it back into composure. Evelyn Sterling leaned forward slightly and asked the question that made Victoria's composure crack even further, wanting to know exactly what Whitmore Industries had offered him. Caleb kept his answer professional and brief, giving only the outline of the role without diving into specifics that were still his to decide alone. Victoria watched the exchange with a stillness that did not match how rattled she suddenly felt underneath it. In the days that followed, Victoria shifted from quiet condescension into something closer to panic, though she never allowed herself to call it that out loud. She forbade Caleb from discussing the Whitmore offer anywhere inside the building, insisting to anyone who would listen that Whitmore Industries only wanted to destabilize Harrington Group from the inside. She had the Human Resources Department pull Caleb's employment agreement, hinting strongly that some kind of restrictive clause would prevent him from taking a position with a direct competitor. The company's own legal counsel reviewed the contract within hours and confirmed there was no clause preventing Caleb from accepting outside employment in the way Victoria had assumed there would be. Undeterred, she pivoted to a different strategy, insisting that Caleb finish rescuing the Davenport account before anyone would even discuss the possibility of him leaving. Caleb told her, without raising his voice, that he owed the company professional work, not ownership over the rest of his future. Victoria did not have a response to that, and she did not try to manufacture one. She sat behind her desk after he left her office, staring at the closed door for a long moment, running through the calculations she had leaned on for years, without ever once questioning whether they were built on solid ground. She had always assumed that people in Caleb's position operated from a place of quiet desperation, that the fear of losing stability would always outweigh the sting of being overlooked. It had never once occurred to her that a person could reach a point where the cost of staying became higher than the risk of leaving, and that realization, arriving late and unwelcome, unsettled her more than she was willing to admit to anyone in the building. Meanwhile, Davenport's own operations team requested full access to the internal history behind Harrington Group's delivery decisions, wanting to understand exactly how the promised numbers had come to exist in the first place. The audit trail that came back told a story Victoria had clearly hoped would never surface in front of the board. It showed Caleb's original warning, time-stamped weeks earlier, along with Victoria's direct approval to disregard it entirely. It also showed that Nolan's presentation had drawn almost word for word from documents Caleb had authored, and that nearly every accurate forecast connected to the account traced back to Caleb's own account activity. Evelyn read through the audit personally, several times, cross-referencing dates against what she remembered being said in past meetings. She began to realize that Caleb was not the reason Harrington Group had ended up in this crisis at all. He was, in fact, the person who had tried hardest to prevent it from happening in the first place. Victoria still refused to accept that framing, insisting to the board that operational failures were always a shared responsibility across the entire leadership structure. She ordered Caleb to present a full recovery plan immediately, hoping to reassert control over a room that was slowly slipping away from her. Caleb complied without complaint, delivering a clear, professional strategy built to salvage the relationship with Davenport within the tight window they had left. He made only one request before presenting it, asking that the meeting minutes accurately reflect who had authored the plan and who had made the earlier decision to override his original warning. Evelyn agreed immediately and instructed the board secretary to preserve the complete audit log for a formal internal review. Victoria's face remained composed, but something behind her eyes had clearly started calculating just how much trouble that record could eventually cause her. Caleb's recovery plan gave Harrington Group a real chance to keep the Davenport account, but it came with conditions nobody at the table wanted to hear out loud. It meant accepting a lower profit margin in the short term, reopening supplier negotiations that had already been finalized, and admitting the original mistake directly to the client rather than quietly working around it. Victoria resisted almost immediately, worried about how the concessions would make her look in front of the board, and, eventually, in front of the company's investors. Nolan tried to offer an alternative plan that looked cleaner on paper, full of confident language and very few uncomfortable admissions. Caleb asked him one simple question about supplier capacity that Nolan could not answer, and the gap between the two men's actual command of the material became impossible to ignore. The board began to see, clearly and for the first time in one room, the real distance between the two operations leaders sitting in front of them. It was not a difference of intelligence so much as a difference of exposure, the kind of gap that only forms after years spent actually inside the mechanics of a problem, rather than presenting summaries of it. Nolan had built his career on synthesis, on taking other people's findings and packaging them persuasively for an audience that rarely asked follow-up questions. Caleb had built his on the opposite instinct, on staying in a problem long after everyone else had moved on to something easier, and the difference between those two habits had just become impossible for anyone at that table to unsee. Evelyn turned directly to Nolan and asked who had actually built the original delivery model everyone had relied on for months. Nolan hesitated, glanced briefly at Victoria, and finally admitted that Caleb had built it. Victoria immediately tried to redirect blame toward Nolan for failing to properly credit the work, but Evelyn was not finished with her questions yet. She asked next who had designed the supplier contingency framework the company had leaned on twice already that quarter. Nolan answered again, quietly, that it had been Caleb. Something in his voice had changed by then, the practiced confidence draining out of it a little more with every answer he was forced to give. He was not a villain in any deliberate sense, just a young executive who had been handed credit he had not fully earned and had never found the courage to correct the record himself, and now that record was correcting itself in front of the one audience that mattered most. Evelyn asked one final question, wanting to know who had actually built the entire Davenport recovery framework currently sitting on the table in front of them. The silence stretched long enough that everyone in the room understood the answer before Nolan finally said it out loud. It had been Caleb every time, on every project the company had quietly built its recent success around. The long list of achievements Victoria had used for months to promote her leadership team suddenly revealed a single set of fingerprints running underneath almost all of it. Later that same week, Grant Whitmore sent a formal, fully detailed offer directly to Caleb, laying out the role, the compensation, and the scope of authority in writing. Caleb read through it carefully at his kitchen table that evening, long after his son had gone to bed, the same table where he had spent so many nights quietly rebuilding plans that would end up carrying someone else's name. He read the document twice, then a third time, checking every clause the way he checked every spreadsheet, refusing to let excitement rush him past a detail that mattered. There was no clause hiding a catch, no fine print designed to claw back the authority the offer promised on its face. It was, simply, an honest accounting of what he was worth, written down in language a court could enforce if anyone ever tried to take it back. He signed it the following morning. He did not sign it out of anger, even though he had every reason to feel it after everything that had happened inside that boardroom. He signed it because he finally understood that Harrington Group would never change. As long as Victoria believed she could use his family situation as leverage to keep him quiet and compliant. The next morning, Caleb walked into her office and placed his letter of resignation on the desk in front of her without a single word of explanation. Victoria's tone changed almost instantly, the condescension of the previous week evaporating the moment she understood what was actually happening. The same woman who had told him days earlier that he should be grateful just to have a job now offered him a raise on the spot, starting at a figure meant to sound impressive. When Caleb did not respond the way she expected, she raised it again, then again, until the number sat well above anything she had ever offered him before. She dangled the title of vice president, additional bonus structures, and a schedule flexible enough to accommodate anything he needed as a parent. Caleb turned down every version of the offer calmly, without raising voice or letting the moment turn personal. Victoria's composure finally cracked, and she accused Whitmore Industries of simply using him to weaken Harrington Group from the inside. It was, in its own way, the most honest thing she had said to him all week, an admission that she finally understood exactly how much damage his absence would do, even if she still could not bring herself to say it plainly. She reminded him of the projects still waiting on his desk, the clients who trusted his judgment specifically, the years of institutional knowledge that would walk out the door alongside him if he left. None of it was said as flattery. It was said the way a person adds up a loss they are only now beginning to fully understand. Caleb answered that it might be true, but that Grant was paying him to make decisions, while she had only ever paid him to make decisions someone else could take credit for. She tried one last approach, telling him to think carefully about his family before making a decision this permanent. Caleb looked at her directly and told her that he was thinking about his family, more clearly than he had in a long time. That single sentence quietly closed the exact wound Victoria had spent weeks pressing on, because the very thing she had used to belittle him had become the reason he refused to keep accepting less than he deserved. He finished the conversation professionally, promising a full and orderly handoff of every project currently under his responsibility. Victoria assumed that once Caleb physically left the building, the entire situation would fade quietly into the background the way most departures eventually did. She had no idea the board's internal review, quietly authorized by Evelyn days earlier, had already moved well past its opening stage. The following morning, Evelyn asked Victoria to remain in the building after the regularly scheduled board session for an emergency closed meeting. Victoria agreed, still believing at that point that she remained fully in control of how the rest of the story would be told. The review that followed did not need Caleb's involvement at all, because the paper trail alone told the board everything it needed to know. 2 outside auditors were brought in over the course of several days, working through years of internal communications, meeting minutes, and project files with the kind of patience Victoria had never once shown toward the warnings sitting quietly inside her own inbox. They built a timeline stretching back nearly 2 full years, matching dates against outcomes, matching credit against authorship, matching promises against the people who had actually made them possible. It documented in careful detail how many times Victoria had dismissed direct written warnings about operational risk, often within hours of receiving them, frequently without so much as a reply. It showed how consistently she had elevated Nolan's public credit for work that clearly originated somewhere else, a pattern that repeated itself across nearly a dozen separate projects once the auditors began looking for it. It revealed how she had concealed, for months, exactly how dependent the company's recent success had been on one specific employee, burying his name deeper into the org chart with every quarter that passed. And it showed, plainly and without room for interpretation, how she had allowed an employee's family circumstances to shape internal decisions about pay, credit, and advancement inside the company, a pattern several board members later described as the single most damaging finding in the entire review. Davenport ultimately agreed not to terminate the contract immediately, but only after demanding stronger independent oversight of Harrington Group's delivery commitments going forward, along with quarterly reporting requirements that had never before existed between the two companies. The concession cost Harrington Group both money and pride, a public acknowledgement, however quiet, that the client no longer trusted the company's internal processes without outside verification. Executives who had spent years treating Davenport as a reliable, low-friction account now found themselves preparing detailed reports every few months, a permanent reminder of exactly how close the relationship had come to ending altogether. The board, having read through every page of the review, no longer trusted Victoria's judgment the way it once had without question. Rather than removing her outright, the board took a series of deliberate, formal steps that stripped away much of her direct authority. They removed her from direct oversight of the operations division entirely, placing it under a newly formed reporting structure. They opened a formal, ongoing evaluation of her continued fitness for the chief executive role, with regular updates required for the full board. Victoria was required from that point forward to report directly to a specially formed oversight committee rather than operating with the near-total independence she had grown used to. The reputation she had spent years building, the image of a leader whose decisions were simply not open to challenge, collapsed within the span of a single closed-door session. Word of the oversight committee spread through the company within days, whispered between departments that had once treated Victoria's word as close to final. Executives who had spent years agreeing with her instinctively began asking more questions in meetings, checking details they once would have accepted without hesitation. It was not public humiliation in any dramatic sense, no headline, no formal announcement outside the walls of the company. It was something quieter and, in its own way, far more permanent, the slow erosion of authority that comes when the people around a leader stop, assuming she is always right. Meanwhile, across town, Whitmore Industries formally announced that Caleb would be leading an entirely new division built around the exact skill set Victoria had spent months quietly undervaluing. Nobody at Whitmore framed the hire as some kind of dramatic rescue, because it had never needed to be one. Grant Whitmore had simply recognized, long before that final phone call, an asset that his closest competitor had been actively working to keep hidden. Several weeks later, Caleb's phone rang again, this time with a different name on the screen entirely. It was Victoria, calling for the first time since the day he had walked out of Harrington Group for good. She had not called to apologize, at least not in any full or uncomplicated way, because whatever pride she had left was still doing its best to hold the line. Harrington Group had just lost out on a major new project, one that Whitmore Industries secured under Caleb's direction after a competitive process that lasted months. Victoria asked him, almost carefully, whether he had already been planning his departure before that final phone call from Grant ever came through. Caleb told her honestly that he had not been planning to leave at all, not until that specific afternoon. He added evenly that he had not started considering it seriously until she reminded him exactly how little she believed he was worth. Victoria did not respond right away, and the silence on the line said more than anything she could have offered instead. Slowly, she seemed to understand what she had actually done months earlier, that she herself had pushed her most valuable employee straight into the hands of her biggest competitor. She told him, almost defensively, that she had given him his opportunity in the first place, the chance that had started everything. Caleb did not answer with any anger at all, because he no longer needed to prove anything to her. He told her simply that she had given him a job, not an opportunity, and that the two things had never once been the same. He let that sentence sit for a moment before ending the call politely and setting the phone down on his desk. Later that afternoon, he walked into a strategy session inside Whitmore Industries, a room built around decisions rather than performances. For the first time on any major project slide, his own name sat directly beneath the title, listed clearly as executive lead. Nobody in that room offered him pity, and nobody reminded him that he should feel grateful simply for having a seat at the table. Grant looked across at him as the numbers filled the screen and asked only one simple question, wanting to know what Caleb's call would be. Caleb studied the figures for a moment, weighed the options the way he always had, and gave his answer without hesitation, watching heads nod around the table at a decision made on merit rather than granted as a favor. That evening, driving home with the city lights sliding past the windshield, Caleb thought about the version of himself who had sat quietly through months of being managed rather than led, and he did not feel triumphant so much as settled, the way a person feels after finally putting down a weight they had carried so long they had almost forgotten it was there. He picked his son up from his mother's place a little later than usual, and the boy asked him, the way kids do, how his day had gone. Caleb told him it had gone well, and meant it, and did not bother explaining the rest, because some victories were not meant to be narrated, only lived. Victoria had once believed that a single father would tolerate almost anything just to hold onto a paycheck and keep his family stable. What she never understood was that Caleb had never needed her pity in the first place, because in the end, it was Harrington Group that needed him far more than he had ever needed them.